Hi guys, this is Steven Seiler. For those of you who don't know me, I do a lot of research on, write about, and tweet about endurance training. And on Twitter, about a week ago, maybe a few days more than that, there was a discussion that got started around a new study that used short intervals and compared them with long intervals. Now we're talking the 30-15s, the 30-30s versus the traditional long intervals, which are more like 3 minutes or 4 or even 8 minutes with rest breaks in between. And so this comparison got a discussion going, and I decided that I would chime in and make a video that takes up this issue. So it's going to end up being 3 videos, and the title is, I'll call them short interval stacks or short interval blocks. Is this the new magic workout for endurance athletes? So first I want to take a little step back and give a little background on physiological responses to these short interval prescriptions. Now, this is the study that got everything started. We're going to come back to this a bit later. This is the blog article by Alex Hutchinson that discussed this study. Alex is great at finding interesting studies, or studies he finds interesting, I should say, and then writing about them. And he used the term the latest magic cycling workout. So that always gets a person's attention. Now, I should say these short interval stacks, if you want to call them that, are not new. And maybe the all-time short interval stacker was Emil Zatopek. In the 50s, he set multiple world records, and he is famous for having said, I already know how to run slow. I want to learn how to run fast. And his epic short interval block or short interval stack was 100 times 400 meters. Now that's a little bit longer than we might call short intervals, as I'll get to in a moment, but still 100 repeats of 400 meters with 150-meter jog recoveries. That's 40 kilometers worth of short intervals. This was in the 50s. Now, we remember high intensity interval training, we're basically trying to either really challenge the aerobic system or stimulate the anaerobic system, and often we're doing a bit of both. Particularly with the aerobic intervals, we want to challenge cardiac output, oxygen delivery, and then depending on the intensity, we may push the anaerobic system quite a bit as well, and hopefully stimulate some adaptations in anaerobic buffering capacity and overall anaerobic capacity. Now, when we talk about intervals, I usually kind of divide this up into 4 basic types of intervals. The interval type that I've done the most research on are these longer intervals from 2 to 15 minutes in duration with recoveries between a minute and 3 minutes typically. Now, these short interval blocks that we're going to talk about today, or stacks, or whatever you want to call them, they are work duration periods of, say, 10 seconds up to 60 seconds with a rest interval of 5 to 60 seconds. And we often divide them up into blocks of repeats and then put some rest in between these blocks, maybe 3 to 5, sometimes even longer rest bouts between the blocks. I'm not going to talk so much about the repeated sprint training and sprint interval training today, so we're going to focus on these, and particularly the short interval sessions. Now, let's go back to one of my favorite texts, the textbook of Work Physiology by Olaf Per-Olof Åstrand and Kjell Rodal. My copy is from 1970, and in that book, one of the nice studies they did and reported on was this one. Now this has been prettied up for PowerPoint, but the numbers are taken straight from the book. So here's an athlete that can cycle at 350 watts continuously for 9 minutes before reaching exhaustion. And at the end of that, he has reached his VO2 peak for cycling, 4.6 liters. His heart rate has reached 190, and his blood lactate is very high, almost 17 millimolar. Now, if this athlete then breaks up that work into repeated work and rest intervals of 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, 60 on, 60 off, 2 minutes on, 2 off, or 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off, then we see some very different physiological responses. And what's interesting in all those cases, the athlete is able to continue this work for an hour. So that means they're able to accumulate 30 minutes of work at the same power output that when they cycled continuously, they only lasted 9 minutes. So big increase in accumulated work, and that's kind of one of the ideas of interval training. But what I want you to see here is that even with the same work to rest ratio, there is a big difference that occurs once you get past that 60-second work duration. When you get out to 2 minutes, then you see that the intervals drive the cardiovascular system much harder. VO2 reaches near or at maximal, heart rate reaches near or at max, and blood lactate is much higher compared to the shorter intervals. So this is important, and it's kind of one of the reasons why we define these differently and why I use 60 seconds as kind of that dividing line. Some even use a shorter amount, 45 seconds. Now, here's a study that guys from my lab did 16 years ago. We were inspired by Ostron and some of the things he had talked about, and we wanted to look at the effects of different work bout durations. So in this study, we had well-trained runners and orienteers come into the lab. They did first preliminary testing, and then in random order, they executed these four workouts, either 24 times 1 minute, 12 times 2 minutes, 6 times 4 minutes, or 4 times 6 minutes. And what they always did was have the same amount of recovery as the work duration. Now, basically what we saw is that when we did this and we asked them to do the workout with maximum session effort, the physiological responses were quite similar, and also the perceptual responses were very similar. But there was a difference, and that is that the 1 minute intervals were just too short to really drive the system fully. And so when you compare their responses as a percentage of VO2 max, you see that the 1 minute intervals just didn't quite push them as hard. But once they got to 2 minutes, 2, 4, and 6 all gave very similar responses. And when you look at it on average, as I'll show you as a moment, it was basically no difference. What was different though is the 1 minute intervals were metabolically easier, but they were able to run faster, so they were accumulating more time at a higher speed doing that shorter interval. Overall, though, you might say the cardiovascular or metabolic response was more typical of a submaximal or threshold effort with the 1 minute intervals. The overall average VO2 for all these sessions was almost identical, which is kind of interesting. Now, after that study, we did another one. My good student and a colleague who we lost a few years ago to cancer, he did this study where we chose 4 minute work bouts, but then manipulated the rest period and either had athletes come in and do 6 times 4 minutes at maximum session effort with 1 minute recovery between work bouts, 2 minute recovery, or 4 minute recovery. And when we did that, again, perceived exertion was very similar, so it really didn't help that much to rest longer. It was the same perception of effort and same increase along the way. And then we even did a fourth session where we had them, after we knew what their interval velocity was on average for this workout, we had them repeat that, but we did not give them a fixed rest time. We said just rest as long as you need and not a second longer to achieve the same velocity. And they had to go on feel, so they were blinded to the actual time. And when we did that, they self-selected an average time of recovery between each interval of almost exactly 2 minutes, 118 seconds. All right. So the take-home message here is really in these long intervals, the work to rest ratio doesn't really matter that much. If you get enough rest, and 2 minutes was enough rest, 1 minute was a little bit too short of a recovery time. But if you got enough rest, then it really didn't have much of an impact to rest an extra minute or an extra 2 minutes. So since then, we've typically said 2 minutes rest is enough for these long intervals. Now, when you go down to those short intervals, those short interval blocks like this, then everything changes. Then the rest and work time and the ratio between is really important. So now we go back to 60 years ago and Ostron and Christensen from Sweden, and here they have an athlete that can run on a treadmill at 20 kilometers an hour for 4 minutes before he is exhausted. At the end of 4 minutes at 20 kilometers an hour, he hits his VO2 max, 5.6 liters, and his blood lactate again is really high ventilation, so it's like a VO2 max test. But if he breaks up the work and does repeated work bouts at that same velocity, 5 minutes on, 5 minutes off, 5 seconds on, 5 seconds off, 10 on, 5 off, all the way up to 15 seconds on, 30 seconds off, then you see from this table that you get quite different responses. At the extremes, the 10-5 session pushes the athlete up to VO2 max, whereas the 15-30 session is basically a fairly easy workout with low blood lactate. So in this micro interval or short interval range, you can manipulate the conditions quite a bit and get quite different physiological responses. Now, here's another example. Using a 400-meter repeats, those are a little bit longer than the 60-second cutoff, but doing these 400-meter repeats with either 60-second rest or 20-second rest, you see a big difference in the heart rate response. And basically, when you cut that rest down, then you essentially turn those short intervals into one long interval from a metabolic standpoint. And so you see heart rate basically just hovers around maximum under that condition. And VO2 reaches very close to 100% of max compared to a much more manageable or a much lower at least percentage of oxygen consumption when you have the big rest in between. Now here's a study that was done in 2007 on wrestlers who obviously were fit. They weren't runners, but they came into the lab. They did intermittent protocol to establish their velocity at VO2 max, and then they did a series of workouts, either 15 seconds on, 15 off, 30 seconds on, 15 off, or 60 seconds on, 15 off, at the velocity of VO2 max during the work. And then they compared that with a continuous bout to exhaustion. And what you see is that when the work to rest ratio was 2 to 1 or greater, then the metabolic responses drive up towards VO2 max, heart rate climbs, and so forth, as I'll show in a minute. But when we're at 15-15, they reach a kind of a quasi-steady state, and the athlete is basically just cruising along at 70% of VO2 max, even though they're running during the work periods at a speed associated with maximum oxygen consumption. And here you see the perceived exertion for the continuous run to exhaustion, for the 60-15s, for the 30-15s, and here's the 30-15s, and then here's the 15-15s. And over here is the heart rate response, and again, the tougher work to rest ratios push heart rate up to max. So that's some background on short intervals and some of the basic physiological responses that occur. And in the next video, I'm going to talk about or show you some real world examples of this type of training session. See you soon.